way down, but he was a big Church of Christ preacher up around Indiana.
Okay.
He had a farm a lot of times. And I'm a sheriff with the it gets kind of explosive. From 606 AD. And I'll talk to you offline. This is not the time. I don't want to distract you. I try to give you the same respect. I'm sorry, but I'm saying it was okay.
Those kind of things help. If you could have an illustration, it's easier to illustrate.
I'm gonna try my best. You might not get it till 11 o'clock, but you'll see it in the morning. I'm gonna keep this guy. All right. Sit right now. Keep an eye on you.
He's keeping an eye on me.
Hey, Mike, is it?
He's keeping an eye on me.
Dan King. After 24 versus
You have any? You know, we're living on this. No, you're Mr. Williams. I've always been that way. I was looking myself. I like that. Try to think, no matter what you're going to think, you're going to set people right. But the more you can avoid that, the better.
Yeah, something just to go with it.
And I imagine in the army, you could end up dead. You don't get it right.
Right?
All trains. All trains? Safety, what?
I don't know, just a jacket.
Safety, oh, you don't know. Just got the jacket. You didn't hurt somebody. Okay.
Safety. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Did you want to finish it out? Sure.
Definitely not work.
The ones that don't care about it.
Put it that way.
I'm sure it ain't gonna mess up. That's important. Yeah. He didn't really, yeah, I don't know, this one. He didn't say a whole lot, he said, emotion. Shouldn't be happening. That's pretty good. It's good, I'm happy.
Yeah, I don't do much to
It was good.
And that's, and the toll lane.
But that work for lightning, can it be something else like
It could be
I was just asked a question about Autumn.
Yeah.
And she went to the hospital with low white blood cell count from a flu. And I went there this afternoon and she's kind of loving the fact that she can eat McDonald's and have a TV with a remote right here by her head. And Mom and Dad don't say a word. She was going to get a transfusion, but they said the white platelets would just get eaten up by her system because something's not right. And they're going to give her some steroids, 13 something Gala a day.
Oh, I know.
You're a pharmacist.
Well, I didn't like it.
Anyway, they're doing that for 10 days. She's getting released tomorrow.
Good.
She cannot do any sports. It has to be careful because it's like she's a hemophiliac right now.
Right.
And she gets to go back to school and resume her next. She's going to go see a hematologist.
Hematologist.
Right. One of them blood doctors. in 10 days. If anybody wants to see an ugly picture of a visitor at Shane's, it's right here.
Yeah.
Oh, high speed.
Thanks for the update.
Yeah.
Thank you.
She's going tomorrow.
Thanks for going tomorrow. That's so ugly. She gets to watch TV all night.
No, sir. No, you good to go. I'm sorry. No, you good to go.
Needed a text you. Needed a text you. Yeah, that's true. I will. I know. I feel bad.
It's hard to do, Mike.
We're on air, so that's what I'm recording, so I'm not gonna say anything that embarrasses you. We've got a couple more minutes. We're after, I guess.
Sticking out. We saw it, yeah, get the old thing. Do I have time to say something to somebody?
Sure.
We're just in a wait and see mode.
Yes, it will. But we're getting hard. Where it's supposed to be. Yes, sir.
Where has this been? Is it? This makes sense. And it's relevant.
No, that's fine. There's practice.
Why are you sticking it out there for me? Why are you sticking it out there for me to grab?
It was an accident.
Okay, I guess we'll get started. The prayer list is being circulated. When you're done, whoever has it last, if you make sure that it gets over to Joe at the end, I appreciate that. Joe, over here in the corner. We're continuing this study of establishing biblical authority for our beliefs and practices. This is kind of a lengthy introduction, these first couple of lessons that I'm doing. I just wanted to review what we went over last week. Tonight, I'm going to be putting a lot of information out. It's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, potentially. We're going to talk about some church history. We're going to talk about some Greek, if you're into that. And talk about the organization of the church, some of those things. So a wide variety. If we have time, if we don't, then we'll just carry it over into the next week. But I wanted to spend just a few minutes reviewing last week's lesson for the benefit of those who weren't here or didn't have the opportunity to look at it online. So it's going to briefly run through some of the main highlights of last week. I want to also say, first of all, and I don't know if I said this last week or not, but my intent is not to offend anyone here regarding your religious beliefs. That's not my intent at all. What I'm trying to do is go back to the ancient first century church, see what they practiced, using that as our model today. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So please pardon me if I say something offensive. It's not my intention at all. So one of the points we mentioned last week is our mankind's failure to respect divine biblical authority or divine authority has resulted in a lot of confusion in Christianity over the past couple of years, a couple thousand years, I should say. So try to make that point pretty boldly there. We mentioned that Jesus established one church. He said he was going to establish one church, and he prayed for unity of that church. His apostles went around preaching that same message. It was probably like trying to herd cats, trying to keep the brotherhood together during that period of time. So, but that was their challenge. Paul and Jude both warned that there would be a falling away of Christians. Can you let her in, Sue? So they warned of that, and it did happen. We mentioned several challenges that our brethren, these are first century brothers and sisters, we mentioned several challenges that they faced, some of which John and Paul mentioned in their writings. But if you read church history, you find out a lot more than what they mentioned. So I wanted to review those quickly. We talked about several people wanted to hold on to the old law. You know, the apostles had to deal with that problem. Some of the things that they tried to carry over into Christianity. There was a problem with trying to accept Gentiles into the church, the first century church. Asceticism, the act of trying to obtain righteousness through abstinence. That was a really big deal during the first century. The Gnostics, we talked about those influences, and John dealt with those a lot in his writings. The idea that there are two gods, there was an inferior Old Testament God and a superior New Testament God. The dualism concept of the spirit being good, matter being evil, and that Jesus was not really flesh. He didn't come in the flesh. He was just an illusion. John really hit on that hard. Salvation is achieved through some special secret knowledge, gnosis as they called it. So those were some of the problems that our first century brothers and sisters were dealing with, the challenges that they had. Also, there was a problem with trying to blend Christianity with paganism, and tolerance for immorality was a problem. They questioned some of the apostles' authority, particularly Paul. Some felt like Jesus was going to come back, during their lifetime. So that was a problem they had to deal with. Complacency, and of course they had the persecution that was starting and became more prevalent in the latter centuries. So those are some of the challenges that our first century brothers were dealing with. So tonight I wanted to get us over into the second century and talk about some of their challenges, just to also illustrate how much of a mess we made or have made in the process of going through 2,000 years. But I'm not going to go probably beyond the second century much. This is pretty much going to be the end of the history lesson tonight, is just the second century. But not only did they have to deal with theological challenges in the second century, but also dealing with organizational challenges of the church itself. The apostles are all gone. I think, John was the last one. He probably died, around 90 AD or something like that. So all the apostles are gone. There was probably some spillover of some of the gifts of prophecy that we know some of the early Christians had been given through the laying on of the apostles' hands. So there might have been they might have been able to take advantage of some of that for some of those folks that were still alive, being able to interpret the message from the apostles and all. But as far as we know, there weren't any writings. There's no canonic writings from people that might have had the gift of prophecy. None of that's been preserved, if there were any. So that's kind of the state of the church at that time. The apostles are all gone. They have the letters that they left, the Gospels and the letters. None of that had really been canonized, brought into a collection yet. They were just, I guess, passing around letters and whatnot. Still written in the Koine Greek, which was the common language at the time. And an interesting thing about Koine Greek is it is a language that has a very high degree of precision, grammatically and otherwise. So more so than I think English and other languages, even the Romantic languages like Spanish and Italian and that kind of thing. So I don't think it was coincidence that God chose to send his message in the Koine Greek language because of the precision that language has. So some of the earliest, can you let Mark in too?
It's open now.
Oh, okay, thank you. One of the earliest translations of the New Testament was the Vetus Latina, which was a Latin translation. And it was translated somewhere between 150 and 200 AD. So the second century. So that was one of the earlier translations from the Koine Greek into the Latin, which Latin was like the predominant language at the time as being part of the Roman Empire. And this translation predated the Vulgate, the Latin, the German Vulgate in the 5th century, but it was used a lot prior to the Vulgate. So some of the challenges that our second century brethren had to deal with, brothers and sisters had to deal with, was once again, Gnosticism was still prevalent in the second century church. There was the theology of Marcionism. Marcion was, I don't know who he was exactly, but he came up with this theology, and these are Christians. People claim to be Christians. But here again, there's some similarity in some of these different groups, but at the end, we'll try to summarize the collection of them. But this Marcionism, they try to distinguish the two gods again. Once again, a creator God in the Old Testament and an unknown Redeemer God of the New Testament. So that was one of their characteristics of that group. They rejected the Old Testament and Christianity's Jewish roots. They rejected the Old Testament. So the first point there was really similar to Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that same thing about being two gods, and that Jesus was sent by a superior, loving Redeemer God. They emphasized asceticism. They understood Jesus in the docetic, once again, illusionary manner, thinking that that Jesus was just an illusion, not really in the flesh. So that was one of their beliefs as well. Marcionism. As a result, they actually created the first canon, one of the first canons, which consisted of the Gospel of Luke and the 10 Pauline, the letters that Paul wrote, was part of their canon. And because of this movement was fairly popular, and because of that, it forced the mainline Christian groups to try to define the canon better. So that they may have served a good purpose in that respect, in that they kind of forced the canonization of what we have today of the New Testament, and also to assert the unity of the New Testament and the Old Testament together. So that this, even though they were off the rails here a little bit, it was good that it did help move the canon along in its development. They were later condemned as heretics or heresy by the mainstream church. So the Marcionism died out. Gnosticism eventually died out in second or third century. So that was another group. So Gnostics and the Marcionists. The adoptionists were another group in the second century. They said that Jesus was born as a man, but he was not divine. So they denied the virgin birth. They said Jesus was a prophet, and he became divine at his baptism. So I guess that's why they're called adoptionists, that Jesus was adopted as a son of God or as divine at his baptism. Then you had the Jewish Christian Ebionites, or another group. They subscribed to some of this adoptionist theory that Jesus was not that he was man at birth, but not really divine. He became divine at his baptism or his resurrection, one of the two. But they held on to the old law. This group did, trying to follow the Jewish law. They used a Hebrew version of Matthew. Once again, they were ascetic, adopting the strict vegetarian ascetic lifestyle, poverty. They rejected Paul's teachings. They considered him to be an apostate, someone who had fallen away. They preferred James and Peter to Paul. Then you had the Montanisms, who was founded by Montanus. Once again, we're still in the middle part of the second century. This was new too. They were claiming that the Holy Spirit was still actively revealing the Word, similar to some of our recent groups that still believe in current revelation. They had an apocalyptic view of the world, that it was going to end soon. They promoted a strict asceticism once again. Jesus was coming back soon. And they actually desired martyrdom. They divided believers into spiritual and fleshly followers. One perhaps good thing about this group was they challenged the movement that we're going to talk about later in class, a movement towards establishing an episcopate hierarchy. They were trying to fight that somewhat, so that was a good thing. Once again, their presence forced the early church to help define the canon as well, so that was a good thing. They supported or promoted women being active in leadership, and they were also later condemned by the mainstream church as heretics. So that group fell away too as well. So these groups that are having theological differences from the mainstream Christianity eventually were labeled as heretics. Syncretism was another theological belief. Once again, extreme asceticism, overlapping with Gnosticism, total sexual abstinence. They rejected marriage. You see how they would die out. I mean, that group wouldn't last very long, whether they were heretics or not.
Reproduction.
That's right. Self-destructing. Body is evil. They refused to consume meat and wine. They practiced extreme self-discipline to achieve, once again, asceticism. They were later condemned as heresy by the mainstream church. So that group was gone too. And then you had the monarchism, modalism. God is one person. The Father and the Holy Spirit and the Son are different aspects of one God. They're not different beings within the Godhead. So obviously they didn't believe in the Trinity. They were saying that God acted as the Father in creation, the Son in redemption, but the Holy Spirit in sanctification. So one God was what they were saying. Monotheism was preserved there, denied the Trinity. Once again, they were later condemned as heresy. So to summarize all that stuff into a group of second century theological challenges, once again, you had debates over the nature of God. Was he one being, or was he Trinity, or was there three in the Godhead? Were there different gods? Was there a different God in the Old Testament from the God of the New Testament? So the nature of God was one point of contention. The nature of Jesus, was he really man? Was he an illusion? Was he flesh initially and then become divine? Can we achieve righteousness through self-indulgence? That's not the word I want to say. Discipline, self-discipline, thank you. By depriving ourselves of everything, can we achieve righteousness that way? So that was a big thing with a lot of these different groups. Some were still trying to hold on to the Mosaic law and rejecting the Christian roots that were contained in the Old Testament. Was God still revealing himself through man? And then once again, rejecting Paul. Paul just couldn't get a break there. And was Jesus going to come back soon? So this is kind of a summary of all those things that they were dealing with in the second century. So as I mentioned, those theological heresies, many of them eventually died out, but they were deemed as heretical, and they were just removed out of the mainstream Christianity. There were, however, two, I think, very destructive second century organizational, I will call them heresies, because they, I think, were not in harmony with the New Testament. But there were two of those that remained, that started in the second century, and they're with us today. Their effects remain with us today. And one of those is moniscopy. Moniscopy. Who can say that word? Jennifer can say it, right? Try it, Jennifer. Moniscopy. Who can say it? I know.
Episcopy.
Monopiscopy. Thank you.
Monopiscopy.
Monopiscopy. It's a hard thing to say. You got to practice it a few times. I know Dave can say it because he helped me last week. Monopiscopy. Mon, one. Episcopy has to do with the bishop. We want to see that a little bit. One bishop, basically.
One bishop.
So,
Mono and like mononucleosis.
Right. One bishop. So yeah, it's about as bad as mono, probably.
Not as bad as that.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
But that was it started in the second century, as we'll see in a little bit, and it's with us today. In a lot of different organizational structures of different groups, it is still present today. The other is apostolic succession, and we won't have time to get into that tonight, but I'll probably do that next week.
It's brief. I can give you a brief on that.
Okay.
The idea is the apostles put their hands on somebody in the first century, and then those that had their hands put on them put hands on the next one, and the next one, next one, next one. And the Roman Catholic Church strongly believes in that succession, and that allows them to get doctrine pushed through their magisterium.
Correct.
Back to you.
Correct. That's correct. So what that does is that lends legitimacy to the leadership within that group and other groups. Because if they can tie their heritage, if you want to call it, all the way back to the apostles, then that gives them credibility. So that's what that is basically in a nutshell is what that's talking about. See,
If anybody here wants to be entertained for a little bit, go on the internet and punch in popes since supposedly the apostles,
Mhm.
and look at some of these popes
Mhm.
and what they were all about, and what they did. There was some real characters.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
They weren't men of God.
Yeah, there's
Sorry.
a period of time, I don't remember what it is, we may talk about it in the future when we get into this apostolic succession, but there was a period of time that they were really nasty people. Some of the popes that were.
My favorite is there was some kind of something passed. When the Pope sits on the chair, he's close to God.
Yeah, ex cathedra is the doctrine.
Right.
So they make this rule, and he dies, and the next Pope wants to undo that rule. So they went and got the body out of the grave, put him on the chair, and undid his rule. I am not lying.
Yeah.
They put a microphone behind him and said,
That's right. So, but it wasn't just the Pope, it was trying to tie the bishops, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, the bishops of the various churches want to try to promote their bishop, and they want to try to link their bishop back to the apostles as well. So we'll get more into that next time probably, but I want to focus the remaining time we have tonight on monoepiscopacy and talk about the development of that, I would call it a heresy. Have you guys heard of the church fathers?
there you go. There's a whole volume of them.
Right, or the early Christian writers, the Catholic Church and some of the other groups will promote the idea of the church fathers. And this is a list of the early Christian writers that they would call the church fathers up to about the 7th century or so.
Oh, no, man.
So the ones that we'll talk about tonight, and the reason I'm putting this up is because we're going to talk about some of these people and some of their quotations, but it's interesting reading. If you ever go back and want to look, and it's all free, you online read it. These are pre-Nicene. Nicene was around, the Nicene Convention was in the 313, something like that. But the pre-Nicene writers, which would be like from Clement all the way down to Cyprian, it's interesting reading to get a glimpse of what the early church kind of looked like as it was changing from the 1st century New Testament pattern to what it changed to. Anyway, I want to just show you this because we're going to mention some of these folks, but it's Clement of Rome, 89-7, down to, we're going to talk to probably Polycarp is about as far as we'll go tonight. So anyway, this is the 2nd century. So monoepiscopacy basically just means monarchical episcopate. The episcopate has to do with the bishops, and the bishops serving in a monarchical fashion. The definition is a church government where a single bishop holds ultimate authority over a local church or a region, which might be called a diocese, of local churches, overseeing the clergy, which consists of bishops, presbyters, or priests, and deacons. So, and also administration. So, a bishop would be over what they would consider presbyters, or basically presbyters and priests are the same thing in their structure. A bishop would be over them, or you may have an archbishop over other bishops. So it gets kind of complicated. I'll show you an illustration in a moment about that. But basically, it's a single bishop ruling over a church or a group of churches. That is monoepiscopacy. Practice that for next class. So at the close of the 1st century, the apostolic years, even churches as prominent as Rome were still led by a plurality of presbyters or elders. And we'll see evidence of that in some of the writings that we'll talk about in a moment. But I found that to be interesting that the church in Rome was still being led by a group of elders or presbyters or bishops. It's all the same word, all the same office as at the close of the 1st century. Monoepiscopacy was non-existent in the 1st century, as far as I can find. I can't find any evidence that it was existing in the 1st century. The 2nd century, it became like an innovation. They made some changes, and we'll talk about why they did that. So,
Mike?
yeah.
By the 4th century, that's when it comes prevailing. 4th century.
Mhm.
It comes.
Well, I
really-
think actually before then, from what
Yeah.
I can see from some of the writings from Ignatius,
Yeah.
who's the guy that was on the list earlier.
So,
But,
and as you looked at it, those that came along with it from that, from the Nicene Creed,
Yeah, mhm.
what they brought with that and changing everything. And then when you hit the 300s, like you said, about 313, 300 with Constantine.
Mhm, right.
So, he just followed the political
Mhm,
landscape of the day, but they called the shots.
mhm.
And from the religious standpoint, and they had changed doctrine. They manipulated, I put it that way, they manipulated the doctrine.
Mhm.
And that's what led to what you're pointing out to.
Well, also you bring up the point about the combining of the state and church during Constantine's rule, or there shortly after his rule, really created a situation where the church became so involved in the political sphere that it was hard to disagree with the church, because you could be labeled a heretic and executed. I mean, you'd be amazed, and I didn't realize this, but you'd be amazed during how many people have died being labeled as heretic because they didn't believe in original sin, infant baptism, that kind of thing. If you read through the Middle Ages and those time periods when people didn't believe in that stuff, they would be labeled heretic and they'd be killed. I mean, it was just thousands of people have been killed for that, resisting that or disagreeing with that belief. So I mentioned earlier, but by the end of the 1st century, monoepiscopacy was not really in existence. But by the end of the 2nd century, I would say most churches were ruled by a single bishop, with a supporting group of presbyters, which they later called priests, and deacons that were subject to the bishop and the presbytery. So by the end of the 2nd century, this monoepiscopacy had pretty much been pervasive throughout the major groups of Christian churches at the time. And most scholars will attribute the development of this, I'll call it a heresy, monoepiscopacy, to Ignatius, who lived around 110 AD. He supported the concept of a threefold office, which consists of a bishop and a presbytery, eldership, and then which also was priests, and then the deacons. So he had a threefold office structure in his writings, and he wrote very prolifically about monoepiscopacy, as we'll see. Hopefully, we'll get to that tonight. Most scholars will agree that this transition from a twofold structure with bishops and deacons, or elders and deacons, to a threefold was a result of battles against the heresies that we just talked about. Some of those 1st and 2nd century challenges. Most will agree that they were trying to battle those heresies in order to preserve unity of doctrine and also to manage church administration. So that was the purpose or the engine behind why they changed from that 1st century model to the 2nd century monoepiscopacy. I'm sorry, I don't like.
When I get a chance to talk to you, I'm gonna tell you who you're reminding me of because you're so fast. But I'm enjoying what you're saying, and I like what you're trying to give us the history of, like, religion means a lot to me.
Okay.
So I want to learn everything.
And these are all being recorded, so if I say something, you go back and listen again, so might help too, so.
Oh, okay, and we'll all get a recording?
If you go onto the YouTube channel and you subscribe to the, help me, Cleon.
You can see me after class.
Okay, you see Cleon, he'll tell you how to do it.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Yes.
there are three subscriptions on our YouTube channel. One's for the auditorium and one's for the other class and this class. So there's 3 different subscriptions. If you go on there, you can find it.
We're gonna announce that in
Okay.
the middle of the summer.
Okay, but anyway, that was the reason for this devolution, I would say, from the 1st century model to this model, was they're trying to keep all the brotherhood together, battling all these heretical doctrines. But I think they failed in the process of that. Yes, Mary.
A question.
Yes, ma'am.
Nothing happens in isolation.
Mhm.
So in the 1st century, it's my image that when somebody wrote a letter or whatever, the whole congregation was able to hear and see and know you know,
You want the
find
apostle,
out what was in the word.
the apostles.
But I also know that throughout history that there was a time when the word was isolated and hidden in some library and it kept the public from having it. So during this pocket of time that you're talking
Second
about, the second century, what was happening with the word?
Well, the word had not been translated into Latin until like 300 or so. I mentioned that earlier. The Latina Vedas was the first translation from Greek, which the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, Koine, Koine Greek, the common Greek language. And it was translated eventually into Latin for, you know, the folks who spoke Latin in the Roman Empire. And those languages changed eventually to what we call the Romantic languages. You got Spanish and Italian.
Right, but when they're making these decisions and making changes, it sounds like the word has become less, you know,
Well,
it's not exposed to everybody.
I didn't live that time, obviously, but I think there was probably a feeling of, well, you know, we can't, we're having a hard time fighting all these heretical things going on with us that we just talked about. Let's elevate one of our presbyters, one of our elders or pastors to a higher level as a bishop. And then all the bishops will get together, you know, the bishop in Rome, the bishop in Ephesus, and the bishop in Antioch, and we'll get together and have these synods and these councils, and we'll try to figure things out. That's kind of the way this thing evolved, I think.
And the things that they figure out, the things that they're telling the people in their church.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute.
Right,
Dan.
so all for a good thing, but it doesn't end up being.
Yeah, right.
Right, in brief, the apostolic letter circulated individually, and I'm citing
And they shared them, right?
the letter from Laodicea, and so it probably meant a whole lot to a congregation to have copies.
Yeah, and they would make their own copies
Originals,
too. I'm sure they made their own
Like
copies.
in Corinth, I'm sure they were careful to preserve when Paul transmitted the letter to the first and then the second follow-up letter, and then all of the other churches and the churches, so that as that thing began to develop, then the individual letters began to, have you got Matthew? Yeah, I got a copy of Matthew. How about Luke? I got a copy of Luke. And then eventually they're taking the codex and put it into a bound volume like we've got, but Paul would reference, bring the books, the parchments, and the scrolls. So there's a lot of documentation that existed in the days of the apostles, and they were separate.
And I have every reason to believe that every church probably had a copy of all the letters, because if you got, if Laodicea shared a copy of Paul's letter to the Ephesians, someone would make a copy of it.
Scribes.
Scribes. So they would have, I'm pretty sure they all had this collection. They just weren't in a book form. They were just, loose and all. So some of the churches that eventually adopted this monoepiscopacy model were the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, which separated from the Roman Catholics in around 1054, I think. The Oriental Orthodox churches, the Anglican Communion, the old Catholic churches, the Nordic Lutheran churches, some of you probably haven't heard of before, I hadn't heard of them. Some of the Pentecostal groups eventually all adopted this governmental structure. And here's a illustration of what it looks like in the Roman Catholic Church, which probably represents the most, I would say, the most extreme application of monoepiscopacy, where you have the lower level is, folks like you and I, the lay people, they would call us. So there's a clergy and a laity distinction or separation in classes that had developed here. But then you have above that, you'd have deacons, which they're calling ordained ministers, priests, which would serve one parish. They can do things like baptism and confession and the Eucharist, which is the Lord's Supper and matrimony and stuff like that. And above that, you'd have a bishop. So you may have several priests or elders or presbyters, which is what they eventually changed them to priests. And above that, you'd have a bishop that ruled over the priests and the deacons. Then if you live in a large metropolitan area, you'd have an archbishop that would rule over or oversee several different churches that each had their own bishop. And then the cardinals helped the Pope. And so this is kind of the structure that developed from monoepiscopacy. A mess. I would call it a mess. And as a result of this, you know, their efforts to try to fight heresy in the first and second century, ironically, resulted in what I would say even more heresy from this organizational structure that came about. You know, you can look at this list of several things that developed over time, starting with the second century with the apostolic succession, which we briefly mentioned a while ago, the patron saints, calling a priest father. There's a whole litany there of things that developed over time. Let's see what I need here. That's not what I want to do. You're gonna have to press
Do it on the
TV.
Yeah,
Where's the remote?
Is that the road over there?
Yes.
Yeah, touch that button and get rid of the idolatry.
It did.
I
last time.
remember who you remind me of, Tim Conway.
Oh,
Oh.
is that a compliment? I know who he is, but I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
Just don't worship
I'm
the
not-
idol.
I'm not a comic, I'm a comedian.
Speedy
You're a
Gonzalez.
lord.
That's right. Anyway, here's a list. I mean, if you don't know what these mean, you can go online and see what they mean, but these are the theological concepts that have resulted from an organizational structure that controls a lot of different individual churches. This is what, this is what results. And they tried in the groups that practice monoepiscopacy will basically, I guess, impose this on their, the ones that are following. So but this is a development over time of these kind of things. Gary.
Now, for good or for bad, the Roman government was efficient. So they lived under that.
Yeah.
And they saw that, order of different things and modeled itself because it is efficient.
Yeah.
Even though that just spreads heresy even worse.
Yeah, right. I think this is the worst list than what we were dealing with earlier with the asceticism and some of the other things we talked about. This is the worst list, I think.
Right, you take a little humor. You know what a fiddler crab is, don't you? It goes around under the ocean and then it attaches stuff to its shell.
That's a hermit crab.
Oh, excuse me, corrected.
Yeah, that's right.
The hermit crab, we got the hermit crab church there with all that.
Yeah.
They added to the shell while they're running around under the sea.
Yeah. I
Big
mean,
mess.
yeah. Yeah. But anyway, I thought that was ironic to they're trying to fight heresy, but yet in the process, they just create more heresy.
So,
Yes,
Mike, before we even get there, really, this is the preset for the Reformation, which was
Right.
this same system on steroids.
Yeah, right. Yeah, 1500s of Martin Luther. And Martin Luther really was, he still, I think, agreed with some of these things, but some he didn't, like indulgences primarily, I think, was one of the things he didn't agree with. But he was trying to reform the Catholic Church, but in the process, just created another group, or groups. But anyway, so there were several non-inspired, some of the lists that we had earlier of the ancient or the first century writers. There were several non-inspired writers who did not support this concept of monoepiscopacy. So we're going to talk briefly about some of those. The Didache was written sometime around 50 to 120. I don't know. They don't know the exact date. Didache. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Correct me if my pronunciation is wrong. Didache. Thank you.
Yeah.
Was written around still written in the first century, we think. But anyway, this was one of the earlier apocryphal writings, is what I guess they would call them, first century writings. So in this writing, he actually mentioned, whoever wrote the author was, I think it's anonymous. Appoint therefore for yourselves bishops and deacons. So we elders, presbyters, pastors is what a bishop is. It's the thing. And deacons. So there's only two offices. There are two functions there, not three. Worthy of the Lord, men, and then you go on and read there. That was one instance where a non-inspired writer pointed out that there was only two functions there. There was not three. There was not a bishop, elder, deacon arrangement. It was just a bishop and a deacon, or an elder and a deacon. It was two offices or two functions. Clement of Rome wrote around the late 90s there. He was not sure who he was exactly. He was in Rome. Some think maybe he was an elder or a presbyter. Some think he might have just been a scribe or like a secretary passing information along. But regardless, he says, so preaching everywhere in the country and town, they, the apostles, their first fruits, when they had proved them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons unto them that should believe. He doesn't make any mention of a bishop, presbyter, deacon structure. It says bishops and deacons. So, and we'll see later on, bishop is the same thing as a presbyter or a pastor or an elder. Then you've got Polycarp, who was a presbyter in Smyrna, writing, submit yourselves to the presbyters and deacons. There's no mention of a single bishop in that arrangement either. So some of these these non-inspired writers are still describing a two-office or two-function arrangement here, structure. The Shepherd of Hermas is kind of an odd. I've read some of these books, some of these writings. This is an odd one to me, but whoever wrote it, I don't know that we know who wrote it, but he does mention Clement, which I think is the Clement of Rome. He says, he mentions the elders that preside over the church. Doesn't talk about a bishop, elder, deacon structure either. But there was an exception, and that was Ignatius. And Ignatius lived and wrote about the 110 time period. He was a presbyter, which is an elder or a pastor, same thing, of Antioch, which is in Syria. And he was on his way from Syria to Rome to be executed. I don't know the background as to why, but he was marching to Rome to be executed, being fed to the lions, I think, because he talks about having to battle the beasts in his writings. But he wrote 7 letters on his way to Rome. He wrote them to different people and churches. One of the letters he wrote was to Polycarp, which we just mentioned, who was a presbyter in Smyrna. And he, I think, is the first writer of the 2nd century that talks about this threefold, this three-function structure of bishop, presbyter, and deacons. So he actually mentions them in this the letter to Polycarp, bishop, presbyters, and the deacons. He mentions that in that letter. He also writes to a church at Smyrna, and he does the same thing with Smyrna. He mentions the bishop, one single bishop, presbytery, which is is a group of presbyters, and the deacons. He wrote a letter to the church of Philadelphia, and he mentions don't do anything without the bishop whenever you come together. Make sure you include the bishop. But he mentions bishops, presbyters, and deacons. So he's saying some churches have sent bishops, presbyters, and deacons. So he's talking about 3 different functions there again in that letter to the Philadelphians. The church at Rome, he wrote a letter to the church at Rome, but he doesn't mention a bishop to the church in his letter to the church of Rome, which was kind of telling because it appears that even during this time that he wrote this letter, that the church of Rome was still being led by a group of pastors or presbyters or bishops, not a single bishop over presbytery, because he mentions he doesn't mention a bishop at all in his writing there to the church of Rome, which really stands out. He talks about himself being a shepherd. He was in the church at Syria or Antioch, I think it was, which now God has for its shepherd instead of me. So he's saying church at Syria doesn't have a bishop anymore because I'm going to be fed to the lions. But God will Jesus will oversee the church there in my place. But once again, he doesn't mention Rome, a bishop in Rome. So I thought that was noteworthy. He wrote to this church at Trailes, which I don't know where that is. Trailes, I don't know where that is. But anyway,
You think it might be France?
It might
I don't
be.
know. I'm guessing.
It sounds like it might be, yeah. Anyway, he mentions the bishop there, Polybius, and he talks about, once again, the bishop, presbytery, and deacons in that in chapter 2 of that letter. He wrote to a letter to the church at Magnesia, which is famous for milk of magnesia, I guess. I don't know where magnesia
That's
is.
a smooth
Yeah.
move.
Yeah. Anybody know where magnesia is? I have no idea. Anyway, in that letter to the Magnesians, he mentions Demas as their worthy bishop, and he talks about your worthy presbyters, Bacchus and Apollonius. So he mentions 2 presbyters under this bishop and a deacon also, Sodio. And he wrote a church to the Ephesians. He mentions Onesimus. I don't know if it's the same Onesimus that we're familiar with Philemon, but maybe we don't know. But anyway, Onesimus is actually identified as the bishop at Ephesus in that letter to the Ephesians. And once again, we're talking about the early 2nd century here in these letters. He talks about being subject to the bishop and the presbytery, or a group of presbyters or elders. And he mentions the deacon as well. Just another reference there to the presbytery and the bishops as being working together. I'm running out of time. So anyway, I want to finish with this slide here. I know it's a lengthy reading. I'll read it quickly because Jerome in 420 AD, which is the 5th century, he tells us why this transition from a 2 structure with a deacon, or I'm sorry, with a presbyter and a deacon, or presbyter, pastor, elder is one function, and deacon, why it changed to bishop, presbyter, deacon. He tells us why in this letter. He says, therefore, the presbyter is the same as the bishop. So he says they're the same thing. So he knows this. And before, by the instigation of the devil, competitions arose in religion. And it was said among the people, I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos. I'm of Cephas. We're familiar with that in 1 Corinthians. The governance of the church was conducted by the joint council of the presbytery. So that he's saying the presbytery, which was the elders, worked together. But when each person began to consider those whom he baptized as his own rather than Christ, it was decided throughout the world. So as we just saw, a bunch of letters to different churches, it was decided throughout the world that one chosen from among the presbyters should be placed in charge of the others. So one was going to be elevated above the others and have care of the general well-being of the church, so that the seeds of schism might be rooted out. In other words, all this division that we talked about earlier might be rooted out. They're trying to deal with heresy. Someone may think that this is not the teaching of the scriptures, but our own opinion, that a bishop and a presbyter are the same, that the difference lies only in the age of the office. Then he goes on to explain from the scripture that the presbyter and the bishop are interchangeable. They're the same function. This we have shown in order to demonstrate that in former times, those same people were presbyter, whom later on were called bishops. And gradually it was so arranged that the various obligations were entrusted to one person, one bishop. Therefore, just as the presbyters know that by the custom of the church, they are subject to him who has been placed over them as their head, so that the bishops know that according to the custom of the church, they are greater than the presbyters. So he's saying this became a church custom, that the bishops became greater than the presbyters underneath them, and ought to regulate the whole church by common counsel, imitating Moses, who then went on, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this is a very, I think, probably the best explanation I've seen of how this change happened. And on that note, I'm going to end because we're running out of time, but I want Joe to, if you would, to lead us in the final prayer. Anybody have any question or just something quick?
What is the YouTube?
Oh,